When a stray dog entered a packed courtroom and began barking loudly, mayhem broke out. Before taking a seat in the middle of the room, 3 times, something occurred that left everyone frozen in. The courtroom buzzed in disbelief at what this enigmatic dog might be attempting to reveal. With stress as the year's biggest case developed, a high-stakes court dispute that had engulfed the town for weeks every. Reporters were taking notes while spectators leaned forward, ready to hear what Judge Martha had to say. A seasoned magistrate with a reputation for being straightforward, Campbell sat at the bench with her gavel ready to keep the peace. With his legal team opposite him, the defendant, a well-known businessman accused of embezzlement, sat stone-faced. The big oak doors creaked open as the prosecution was ready to make its closing argument. But initially nobody was there. Noticed, but the room's attention was quickly captured by the gentle padding of paws across the tiled floor, and gasps quickly followed. The crowd when a skinny, matted stray dog with dusty fur walked into the courtroom. Its ribs were hardly perceptible, yet its steps exuded an undeniable confidence as it came to a halt in the center of the room and gazed about as though examining the faces, and everyone in the room fell silent, including Judge Campbell. Known for her stern authority, she paused in the middle of her statement, her eyes tightening as the bailiff walked in. The dog let out a single, harsh bark and turned toward Usher. Bailiff paused, and the dog growled once again, louder this time, its eyes focused on the defendant. Uneasiness erupted throughout the courtroom, and whispers started too. Before anyone could pretend, the dog began to bark a 3rd time each. Explain what the dog was doing and why. Sound that echoed like an order, and then it sat with its tail waving slightly, as though to indicate. After the task was completed, the defendant shifted uneasily in his chair, his gaze flitting between the judge and the dog. In an attempt to regain control of the room, Judge Campbell lifted her gavel, but the bailiff gasped and pointed to. A small key dangled from the dog's collar, glinting in the intense fluorescent light. What was this key, and why did the dog appear so focused? The lights in the courtroom froze. Being present at this precise moment caused the environment to sizzle with tension as everyone held their breath, anticipating Judge Martha's next move. Campbell's gaze never left the stray dog, who was sitting with assurance in the center of the courtroom with the key hanging. For the first time in her long life, she saw the light from its collar reflecting onto the faces of the curious audience. When professional Judge Campbell ran out of things to say, she leaned forward a little. The dog is secured by her normally steady hands holding the edge of the desk bailiff. The bailiff paused for a moment before her voice eventually broke the startled silence. Paused, then slowly went up to the dog. The stray didn't move its eyes stayed fixed on defendant David Hollis, the affluent businessman who is said to have embezzled millions of dollars from. Hollis writhed in his chair, his pristine facade displaying local charity. "What's going on here?" the defense lawyer yelled, getting up from his chair as the dog's presence unnerved him. "This is really erratic. Take the animal out right away." The prosecutor watched the scene in silence. Watching with curiosity, prosecutor Elaine Morgan, who is renowned for her keen intuition, spotted the defendant's uneasiness and narrowed her eyes, whispering to her assistant, "He's nervous, why?" When Baith knelt down to examine the stray's collar, the dog led him. The bailiff unhooked the little corroded key and sat motionless, as though it realized how serious the situation was. He added, his voice tinted with pride, "This key was attached to the dog's collar, so the judge could see her honor." Judge Campbell exclaimed incredulously, furrowing her brow, "What does it unlock?" The dog got up and started toward the defense table before anyone could respond, its motions purposeful, and the throng erupted in deliberate gasps as it came to a halt right in front of Hollis, who was sitting once more and emitting a. Hollis backed away with a soft growl, his face going pale, his hands firmly grasping the table. "This is some sort of ruse," and Hollis's attorney asked that his voice rise in anger. Judge Campbell lifted her hand to hush him sufficiently, saying, "Honor, this is an outrageous disruption." Her tone was harsh. "Secure the dog with the tension bait and set it aside for the time being." "Return to wait," Prosecutor Morgan said, getting up from her chair. "Honor, could I just examine that key? It might be pertinent to Judge Campbell's case." Morgan took the key from the bailiff, who nodded hesitantly. Morgan's keen eyes expanded a little as she studied it carefully. She noticed a faint engraving on the rusty metal as she turned it over in her hands. An insignia she knew from the evidence. Morgan said, "File this emblem," while displaying the courtroom key so that matches could be seen. And murmurs Hollis. Ed mentions the emblem of a private storage facility in town that is connected to Mr. Hollis. Judge Campbell silenced the lawyer's loud protests by banging her gavel, which led Prosecutor Morgan to proceed quietly. Morgan came forward with a strong, assured voice. "Your Honor, we've been. After months of investigation, we think Mr. Hollis concealed important evidence by using a storage facility with a false name. Records that would demonstrate his misappropriation. This key could help us find a proof that made the audience humming." Judge Campbell maintained his composure despite the excitement and amazement. "Do you have enough to ask for a search warrant for?" "Yes, Your Honor," Morgan said, pointing to a prepared storage space. "Motion in light of this recent discovery, I think we have good reason to search the facility right away," according to Hollis's attorney. Banged his hand against the table. "This is ridiculous. You cannot issue a warrant based solely on a stray dog's behavior." Is becoming a circus judge. Judge Campbell gave him a stern look. "Mr. Carter, if your client has nothing to conceal, therefore he doesn't need to worry about Prosecutor Morgan. Your motion is approved, and he will accompany the..." The bail nodded and hurried out of the courtroom with the prosecution to make sure the warrant is executed immediately. Morgan was holding the key securely, and the dog was still seated close to Hollis. Observe them depart, its tail swinging slightly as though content with the development, and Hollis's face had changed from pale to ashen, and he muttered an angry message to his attorney, who was having trouble keeping his cool in the courtroom. Campbell told the audience that we would postpone until further notice in order to make sure the puppy was retained and cared for. Although this circumstance is unprecedented, we must follow the evidence. Whispers flooded the air as the room started to empty. Who was this dog, and how had? Judge Campbell stayed at her bench to observe what would be in the storage container and to bring the key. For the first time in years, she felt intrigued as the dog was carefully led out of the room. This was not your typical case, as she had known since her first days on the bench, and the courtroom was empty when the dog appeared, but the mystery grew. What secrets did the storage? Why was this wandering dog the catalyst for exposing them? And what did the unit hold? Outside the courtroom, the anxiety was evident as the next phase of this remarkable case was set to begin. The rusty key she was holding felt as Prosecutor Elaine Morgan and the bailiff raced toward the storage facility, heavier with each second that went by, as though it were bearing the weight of the truth they were going to reveal about the stray canines. She kept thinking about mysterious behavior and the likelihood that this animal of all creatures would give them a break. Judge Campbell remained in her chambers, unable to get rid of the feeling that they sorely needed back in the courtroom. That this case was more complex than first appeared, and her thoughts turned to defendant David Hollis, whose abrupt discomfort with the dog's look hadn't gone unnoticed. His response was disturbing. In the meantime, Hollis sat in a private meeting room with his lawyer, feeling more than just irritation at the interruption. "This can't be happening," he mumbled, his composed exterior buckling under the strain. Pacing the floor, his lawyer Carter asked how they even knew about the storage facility. "Try to tell him that we knew that key, but we have no idea what they'll uncover." Hollis wasn't persuaded, so he stopped pacing and gazed out the window with his jaw clenched, even if it might be pointless. "Locate the documents. Morgan and the bailiff are at the storage facility." A wiry man in his 60s, the facility manager, arrived with the warrant in hand. As they stated their goal, he remarked incredulously, "You're saying this key came from a dog?" Morgan looked perplexed, nodded in a stern tone, "Yes, and we think it opens one of the units here. Would you kindly?" The manager shrugged and guided them to the unit that matched the serial number written on the. As Morgan inserted the key into the lock, the atmosphere was charged with excitement. It opened very easily, exposing the bailiff's black inside. Morgan walked ahead after turning on a flashlight, which revealed rows of file boxes arranged neatly inside. Her breath froze in her throat as she opened the closest box, which contained contracts, ledgers, and documents. Using neatly arranged receipts, every document appeared to provide a damning account of embezzled funds. Morgan muttered, We have him as word of the matter. This is it. Money laundering and fraud. As soon as the finding arrived in the courtroom, reporters rushed to update their accounts, and whispers filled the. As word got out, Hollis's attorney asked for a recess, but the court turned it down. We'll go ahead as scheduled. Judge Campbell declared in a firm voice that if the evidence is accepted, Hollis will be shown it. Perspiration leaned toward Carter and said, "You must stop this." He screamed, "There must be a means to undermine that proof." But Carter shook his head, his self-assurance ebbing. The secret came straight from the. We can't argue this away, Dog Hollis, while the dog is temporarily entrusted to a nearby animal shelter, where they calmly slept, and the workers couldn't help but be amazed by the. One of the employees said, "He's scratching like he knows he's done something important." They chose to give in the name Justice behind the dog's ears as a respectable homage to Morgan's unanticipated bravery when she returned to the courtroom with boxes of evidence was greeted by a. As she introduced the first set of documents, the standing room only throng erupted in excitement. She started speaking to Judge Campbell, and these documents verify that Mr. Hollis has been embezzling money from. She held up the key, which allowed her to trace and detail the transactions from several charities into offshore accounts. The missing link was highlighted, and the defense rushed to raise objections, but Judge Campbell waved them away so she could finish. Morgan kept talking steadily and thoughtfully, saying, "We think these funds were meant for underprivileged children. Instead, they were directed toward community, housing projects, and medical research. Accounts that Mr. Hollis had under several aliases." The room became quiet as. Hollis's pale face became scarlet, and then white as the weight of her words sank in. The once self-assured businessman now appeared to be a cornered animal as the day's reality set in. Judge Campbell spoke to the courtroom as the hearings came to a close, citing the evidence that was given today. "The court has good reason to try Mr. Hollis, and you've been remanded into custody until further notice." Reporters burst into the room as the gavel struck, hurried to submit their accounts, and while the prosecution and spectators exchanged silent nods of contentment. But despite all the chaos, one question persisted in everyone's thoughts. Morgan paused to catch her breath and glanced up at the gray, wondering how the dog had been known to step in outside the courtroom. As she made her way to her car, the day's burden finally began to weigh on her shoulders, and she couldn't stop thinking. Concerning Justice, the dog who had completely reversed the case, I occasionally. The courtroom hummed as she whispered to herself that the universe operates in odd ways, with tension as the case developed. But the prosecutor's story was far from over. With the incriminating evidence at her disposal, Elaine Morgan knew she still had the advantage. She kept thinking that the mystery surrounding the stray dog was remained unsolved. How had the animal come to be? She kept thinking about the key and why it had shown up at such a crucial time when the trial was. Later that night, when Morgan got back to her office, the meeting was adjourned for the day. A call arrived from the neighborhood animal shelter, and the employee on the phone sounded thrilled. "Miss Morgan, we believe you should. Look, there's something you should know about the dog, just Justice. Morgan is intrigued and is going to the." Justice greeted her with a bouncing tail and bright eyes when she arrived at the shelter. A young woman named Carla, who worked at the shelter, gave Morgan a. Justice had this tucked under his collar, concealed beneath the key, but we didn't find it until now. It was a faded dog tag. It appears to be a name tag. Morgan looked closely at the tag and saw that the etching was worn. However, she was still able to identify the name Max and an address outside of town, so she chose to visit the place the following morning. Morgan showed up at the address indicated on the tag a little. She knocked on a dilapidated farmhouse with overgrown grass surrounding it, and an old man replied, his face brightening as he noticed the tag in her hand. "I'm crying," the man said. You could see Max Morgan's eyes as he told the man the circumstances. Describing the dog's valiant deeds in court, the guy identified himself as Henry, a retired locksmith who had lived till. He described how Max, his devoted German shepherd, had vanished after being alone for years. "I believed I had lost him forever during a storm months ago," but Henry's voice. Morgan asked Henry if he was trembling because to me, he is more than just a dog. He is my family. Henry glanced at the key that had been fastened to Max's collar. his face changing from joy to recognition. "That's one of my old keys," he replied slowly, to confuse. "Yes, I used to make spare keys for local residents, but this particular one is David Hollis Morgan's." Henry nodded with a pinched brow in agreement as David Hollis, the defendant in our case, froze. Hollis paid me to produce keys for a private storage unit he had years ago, claiming it was for business purposes. Extra to be silent about it. At the time, I didn't give it much thought, but is this connected to the trial? Morgan's thoughts raced. Max must have discovered the storage container while exploring the town as the pieces started to come together. The key in delivering it to the courts through some amazing twist of circumstance or intuition. The relationship between Henry Morgan stated that Hollis and the key were too important to overlook in her tone. "I need you to accompany me to the courthouse because you may have just discovered the missing piece in our case. Provide a statement." The trial then proceeded in the courtroom with much expectation. Hollis now looked anxiously at his attorney as Morgan got ready to share her most recent research, and she introduced Henry too. "Your Honor," Morgan started speaking to the judge after the court explained his relationship to the key and the defendant. "Henry Dorson, a retired locksmith who was employed by Mr. Hollis for a number of years, has attested to this, Campbell. The key that the stray dog Justice gave us was for a private storage facility that belonged to the defendant." Whispers broke out in the courtroom, and Hollis's attorney promptly objected, saying, "Judge Campbell rejected the hearsay and allowed the witness to testify," she stated forcefully. Taking the stand, Henry described how Hollis had employed him and did so with a level of clarity that was unexpected for his age. "I had no idea that he was being paid more to keep quiet under dubious conditions. Henry came to the conclusion about what he was concealing in that unit, but I knew it wasn't above board." Morgan then provided more documents from the storage facility that provided proof of Hollis's involvement in the embezzlement plot, together with the testimony of Mr. Dawson, created direct connection between the defendant and the Elalak's weave. Moreover, she claimed that although Hollis's attorney tried to find flaws in the testimony, the jury members suffered the consequences, exchanged knowing looks, and when the court adjourned for the day, their mistrust of Hollis grew. As the case was coming together in her favor and Justice the stray dog's favor, Morgan couldn't help but feel victorious. Had turned out to be a surprising hero, but the riddle of how Max got the key still baffled her. Was it a coincidence, or was there more to the tale? Morgan went to the She was sitting with Justice and scratching behind his ears at the animal shelter again. "You are more than just a dog," she thought, reflecting on the amazing series of events that had led them to this point. Justice waggled his tail and met her clever gaze, saying, "Aren't you?" When the trial started the next morning, the courtroom hummed as if to say, "You'll see." There was a sense of expectancy as the key's revelation and its relationship to the defendant changed the case in such a way that David Hollis and his legal team are clearly shaken. Judge Martha Campbell arrived in the room with her customary coolness, concealing the curiosity that was racing through her head about how, after a stray dog disrupted a complex case, prosecutor Elaine Morgan sat at her desk, going over her notes at her workstation, periodically looking back at the courtroom where Henry Dorson had. Nevertheless, the retired locksmith turned out to be an unanticipated linchpin in the case, and his evidence gave the prosecution's story next to him, Max, who is now lovingly known as Justice. Sitting calmly, he attracted admiring grins from everyone who saw him, but the defense team. Carter, Hollis's attorney, was everything but calm as he paced back and forth, obviously trying to save his clients. Eroding defense Hollis sat stiffly on his chair, his fists clenched as the pressure increased, and, as the hearing started, it became impossible to overlook the fissures in Judge Campbell's self-assured exterior. Told the court that the material that was provided yesterday has raised important issues in this trial. Serious concerns regarding the defendant's behavior and intentions. Prosecutor Morgan, kindly move on with. I would like to call your next witness. Morgan, who stood and walked calmly and confidently up to the bench. Officer Rachel Torres has been looking on allegations of suspicious activities connected to. Torres took the stand in the defendant's storage unit, looking sharp in her uniform and, with solemn expressions, she described the findings of her inquiry. how concerns of odd deliveries had put the storage unit under observation for months, and we believe the unit was being utilized illegally because of the nighttime activity. Yes, but up until now, Morgan, we didn't have enough proof to get a warrant. Nodded. And did you see anything or anyone that could link this unit to Mr. directly throughout your surveillance? Yes, Hollis, Torres said, and we have records of Mr. Hollis's car making several visits. He frequently arrived late at night and lingered for long periods of time. His logs demonstrate that he frequently made these visits. The courtroom mumbled when Morgan showed timestamp pictures of Hollis's parked automobile throughout the previous year. These pictures outside the storage facility, Your Honor, further support Mr. Judge Campbell leaned forward, her eyes keenly focused on Dawson's testimony and the documents taken from the storage facility. Would you like to cross-examine the witness, Mr. Carter? Carter's expression. He tried to put doubt on Torres' evidence by approaching her. So are you, officer? Tight yes, Your Honor. I'm positive that my client made these visits and that Torres didn't use someone else's car. In addition to visual proof, flinch, sir, we also match the... Carter persisted in trying to undermine Mr. Hollis, but there is no question that it was him who gave the car's license plate. Hollis. It was evident by his expressions that they weren't believing his claims when the proof fell flat. Appeared to want to vanish into his chair, but as the day went on, Morgan made the decision to return to the roll-up. During a recess, the justice in the case addressed Judge Campbell with an uncommon request. Your Honor, I would like to officially present Justice as a pivotal player in this case, whose activities directly resulted in the identification of the evidence against Mr. Hollis, and I think his presence could offer important context for the chronology of events. Are you suggesting that we call the dog to stand? Judge Campbell said, and Miss Morgan laughed quietly. Entirely, Your Honor, but I do think the jury should be aware of the entire background of how this evidence was. Justice's involvement in this case is unprecedented, and it's crucial to recognize that after a moment's. Judge Campbell gave a thoughtful nod, so you can move forward when the trial begins. Return to speak directly to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to take a pause to talk about how this key and the proof it helped us obtain were provided to us by this. She pointed to the rear of the room, where Justice was sitting triumphantly next to Henry the... As the entire courtroom focused on him, the dog's ears perked up. Justice's deeds may look, Morgan went on to say, beautiful, even unbelievable, but they highlight an important truth times the most unlikely. Heroes are able to expose injustice by their intuition and resolve, traits that are frequently linked to loyalty and honesty. And in this instance, the jury has found them to be quite valued. Members nodded as they gazed at the dog, their faces softening. Even Judge Campbell couldn't conceal a slight smile, but Hollis's poise was quickly failing him, so he leaned toward. Carter's voice was quiet but desperate. Something has to be done. This cannot continue. Carter shook his head, saying that since the evidence is indisputable and Hollis clenched his fists, his face flushed since the jury was already against us. As the day's events came to an end, he whispered, anger, this isn't over. The narrative of Justice's involvement in the Morgan case clearly affected the jury, felt a renewed feeling of resolve, because the case was now about more than merely revealing Hollis's transgressions. As the trial went on, it became clear that honesty and truth, no matter how improbable, might prevail. The courtroom was alive with conjecture and interest on the extraordinary contribution of the stray dog to the case, while the Justice E. Holland's defense team was working feverishly behind the scenes as the public and jury became increasingly enthralled with the case. Attempting to come up with a plan to refute the facts and take back control of the story that night, Elaine Morgan, weary but determined as she went over the case files at her office. When her phone buzzed, it was an email with the subject line, anonymous, from a reporter who had been following the trial. Morgan was interested by the hint about Justice and Hollis' connection, so he opened the email. It was a brief but startling letter. Justice wasn't a stray. Years ago, Hollis trained him for private security on his estate. If you look into it more, you'll discover more than you anticipated. The sender is still AD anonymous, but the assertion left Morgan stunned. Could it be true? The very individual he assisted in exposing the potential raises a serious question. Justice once belonged to, had a past relationship with Hollis. Was his actions genuinely innate, or was there? Morgan made the decision to visit Henry Dewson in order to learn more about the untold story. Once more, the retired locksmith who had previously provided Justice with care would be the one who learned the truth about his background. Morgan arrived at Henry's farmhouse the following morning when the trial started. Henry brought her inside and offered her a cup of tea when she arrived, and Justice welcomed her with his customary zeal. Outlined her worries to Henry, and I learned that Justice may have previously been related to David Hollis. Do you know anything about this case? Henry scowled, his face hazy with. Believed that he could have confessed when I discovered Max Justice walking around. He was well-fed and had just received care on the outskirts of town, but other from the tag, he had no collar or identification. I always found it strange that a dog like him would be left at my location. Morgan's thoughts were racing. And you? Henry shook his head, but I didn't give it much thought at the moment because I thought it was from. Years ago, I completed a random job, but now that I think about it, I did some work for Hollis previously, and he had a security detail with canines that, if Justice had really been one of Hollis's trained security dogs, then his presence was starting to make sense. It was not merely a coincidence in the courtroom. Rather, it was fate. Meanwhile back, during a recess in the courtroom, Hollis was becoming more and more desperate. He cornered his attorney Carter in the hallway and said, "We need to take charge of this story." If they dug too far, he snapped, "They'll learn details about Justice's past that I can't afford to reveal." And Carter became so irate that he puked up his. "Unfortunately, David, this train cannot be stopped because the evidence against you is so strong and the jury is already." Hollis's eyes clouded as she said, "Unless you have a miracle up your sleeve, there's nothing I can do." A menacing gleam in his eyes. Perhaps we ought to do them justice if they intend to. Anything else to concentrate on the next day? A startling revelation interrupted the trial. A video purportedly depicting Justice in a prior fight with a guy at a worksite appeared online. View the blurry but discernible video that seemed to show the dog. When it was discovered that the man was one of Hollis's former employees, Justice sprang violently at him. Carter seized the chance to show the video in court without delay. "For your honor," Carter, citing it as proof that Justice was a volatile beast with a violent past, claimed that this video raises significant concerns regarding the veracity of this dog's actions and whether he can be trusted as the case's hero. The jurors looked at each other uneasily, and even Judge Campbell appeared momentarily surprised by Morgan. But she stayed calm and asked for a quick. During the interval, Morgan diligently collaborated with her team to confirm the video's authenticity. Nevertheless, it was quickly discovered that the film had been significantly altered to portray Justice negatively. Illumination, the initial security camera footage, showed the entire. In the background, Justice had been protecting a youngster who had gotten lost on the building site and setting himself up. Morgan didn't waste any time in presenting the toddler with a piece of falling debris. According to her conclusions in court, the defense has shown a deceptive video to damage Justice's reputation. She said the original video makes it quite evident that Justice's. When she played the uncut film for the courtroom, the atmosphere changed from one of aggression to protection. As soon as the jury witnessed Justice endangering his own safety, applause erupted across the room. The tide had once again gone in favor of saving the youngster, and Hollis's attempt to discredit the dog's function had failed. Magnificently as the day came to an end, Morgan considered the difficulties that had emerged and the tenacity of the truth. Justice had often demonstrated his loyalty-driven behavior and the purity of his instincts. In defense for Morgan, the case had evolved beyond a simple pursuit of justice. It was evidence of the connection between people and animals, as well as the remarkable ways in which that bond could transform lives. The next day, the tension was high in the courtroom as Hollis's attempt to undermine Justice failed. But the ripple consequences persisted. The jury seemed to be struggling with the case's emotional burden, which was now compounded by the dogs. Prosecutor Elaine Morgan replaced her due to the astonishing story and the defendant's growing desperation. The increasing intricacy of the trial had tempered her confidence at the bench, and she realized she needed to stay focused and maintain the jury's confidence, particularly when Holland's defense team grew more erratic throughout the trial. The retiring locksmith moved as Morgan invited Henry Dawson back to the stand. He stepped forward, anxiously adjusting his glasses as he readied himself to testify regarding how justice entered his life. And, finally, the courtroom fell silent as Morgan explained how he had guided them to the proof. Started asking Mr. Dawson Morgan questions, and her steady, quiet voice asked, "Can you describe your initial contact with Justice Henry?" He cleared his throat. "When I opened my back door after hearing scratching on a stormy night, I saw that he was cold and damp." Morgan nodded, as if he had been looking for miles, and I was unable to turn him away. "Did you notice anything odd about him?" Henry repositioned his spectacles, and sure enough, he had a. At first, I didn't give it much thought because I assumed it might have belonged to his former owner. However, I later identified the key's shape. It was mine, and the jury leaned. Morgan continued to be enthralled, and upon looking at the key, "What did you?" I was surprised to learn that it was a unique design I had created for a safe story unit years prior. "Appear in this way again, particularly on a dog's collar." Morgan turned to the jury. Thus, this key ultimately brought us to evidence that was directly related to the defendant. "Justice brought you a stray puppy that showed up at your door. Is that right?" Henry nodded. "Yes, ma'am." When Morgan moved aside to cross-examine Henry with Carter Rose, his tone was abrasive. "Mr. Dawson, his inquiries are meant to raise doubts. Couldn't this dog have arrived from anywhere that the—" Henry scowled, his fists clenching around the edges of the key, which might not even be connected to my customer. Witness stand, "I guess it's feasible," but Carter cut him off. "You can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this dog is related to my client, Morgan. Are you?" Judge Campbell upheld it after an objection, but doubt had already been sown. During the meal, Morgan sensed the delicate balance of the case shifting again as the jurors exchanged doubtful looks. During recess, Morgan sat by herself in the cafeteria of the courthouse, her mind racing. Was aware that the defense was attempting to influence the jury's opinion by taking advantage of the trial's emotional impact. Justice's position, she required a plan to bring the narrative back into focus and remind the. Henry walked up to her as she sipped her coffee, a jury of the indisputable facts. Table Justice was faithfully trotting with him when Miss Morgan Henry stated, Considering what Carter mentioned, it's possible that he's correct and that there is no way to determine Justice's origins." Morgan. "Henry, don't let him influence you. The evidence is clear." She shook her head. Henry sighed, reaching down to scratch. "Justice led us to the key, and the key led us to the truth. Just behind the ears, Ms. Morgan is a good dog. I just hope the jury notices that when the tension in the courtroom increased, Morgan made the decision to deal with the emotions. She introduced Dr. Sarah Bennett, an expert in animal behavior, to the undercurrents head-on. The purpose of Dr. Bennett's testimony was to emphasize Justice's special intuition and acts providing a scientific explanation for his conduct. Dr. Bennett grinned kindly and asked Morgan, "Can you explain what might drive a dog like Justice to act in the way he did?" Are highly observant animals that develop close relationships with people and are frequently motivated by loyalty and a desire to. Morgan nodded, indicating that Justice's actions demonstrate a tremendous level of understanding and insight. Would you say that Justice's behavior is similar to that of a dog that may have received prior training? It's very. Dr. Bennett most likely responded that he could get the key and deliver it to Mr. Morgan turned to the jury after Dawson mentioned a history of training, perhaps in security or protection. So even if Justice's past is still unknown, but his actions and instincts in this instance were remarkable. Do you agree, Dr. Bennett? Indeed, she stated that Justice's actions show not only wisdom but, additionally, the jurors appear to be moved by Dr. Bennett's unwavering loyalty. Testimony, but the defense was not yet complete, and Carter maintained a somber demeanor. Dr. Bennett inclined her head. Isn't it true that dogs, no matter how well trained, can act in unpredictable ways? That is somewhat accurate, but in my experience, a dog's behavior is. Justice's actions in this instance indicate a history of care and nurturing, which is frequently indicative of their surroundings and upbringing. Training rather than uncertainty. Carter persisted, but Dr. Bennett's composed authority. Manner remained unwavering. The jury's confidence in Justice was starting to grow again, and by the conclusion of the day, Morgan felt a renewed optimism that the truth was standing firm in spite of the defense's efforts to weaken the case. Presence in the courtroom was a potent reminder of the remarkable connection between people and animals, a connection that may transcend reason and illuminate the most dire circumstances. As the trial went on, the courtroom appeared to be pulsing with suspense, with each new development drawing the jury more into. Prosecutor Morgan understood that she needed to maintain the momentum in her favor given the intricate web of events, but the morning session started with a shocking turn of events that would raise the stakes even further. News from the defense team of Hollis. Carter came to the bench with a folder, his face grim yet. "Decided, Your Honor," he said, introducing the defense attorney, Judge Campbell, "has acquired fresh information that we think is essential to this case and that directly relates to the prosecution's." Justice Morgan's reliance on the dog made her tense, and she stared at Carter. "Carter, is this evidence?" she asked in a calm but suspicious tone. Opened the folder and gave the judge a document. "According to the documents we have, Justice's real name is Max. Was formerly enrolled in a private security-specific K-9 training school. According to his records, he was specifically trained to retrieve stuff, and it's possible that his presence at the crime scene wasn't as random as the..." According to the prosecution, a whisper reverberated around the courtroom as the jury discussed. Their interest was piqued by this fresh information, but Morgan declined to. Startled, she promptly asked for a break to go over the documents and draft a counterargument. When Morgan and her colleagues went through the documents, they seemed authentic and described Justice's enrollment in his subsequent assignment to a security company after training at a private K-9 facility. Morgan resorted to her after learning of the surprising but not wholly unexpected revelation that it was owned by none other than David Hollis. Help a young Pargal named A.A., who had been crucial in obtaining the proof we needed to confirm the veracity of these documents and discover the reason behind the delay in bringing this to light. Ava nodded her. If the recordings are authentic, her fingers are already flying over the keyboard on her laptop. There must be more to the tale. And in the meantime, the jury's view of justice was becoming to alter the defense's revelation, which sowed doubts that the dog's actions may have been planned or impacted by earlier instruction. Carter took advantage of the chance to cast additional. Having a former K-9 facility trainer testify about the trainer raises questions. When asked, a tough guy called Martin Hayes took the stand with assurance and declared, "Yes, I remember Max. Regarding Justice, he was among the best dogs we have ever trained. He was observant, obedient, and..." Carter's tone was measured and he leaned forward, showing incredible loyalty. "Could you describe the type of training Max received?" Hayes responded that he was trained in object tracking and retrieval. Acknowledgement that he would obey orders without question if you provided them to him. Carter turned to the jurors with a slight smile. "Thus it's safe to assume that Max's capacity to..." Hayes hesitated, looking for his training, not some mystical instinct, to discover and collect the key. "I guess you might say that Justice was calmly resting at Henry Dawson's feet, that he acknowledged," but his tone was unconvinced. Morgan's cross-examination of Hayes concentrated on the shortcomings in his testimony. "Mr. Hayes," she started by saying that Justice Max was educated at your establishment. Could you verify if he was still in your custody or working for Hollis at the time of the..." Hayes shifted uneasily, saying, "No, he wasn't. He had been. Morgan was seized after going missing for years, leading us to believe he was either stolen or abandoned. The chance, thus you can't claim with certainty that his behavior in this circumstance was impacted by his..." Hayes hesitated and said, "No, I can't," but Morgan nodded. Speaking to the jury, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a dog that, in spite of being left on its alone and abandoned, showed exceptional intelligence and devotion to his training. May have come from his background, but his actions in this instance were his own, demonstrating the connection between people and animals, and this specific dog's exceptional qualities outside the courtroom." A.A. returned with new. She had discovered a string of emails sent between Hollis and the K-9 that changed the course of events once more. Hollis had purposefully left Justice after a failed security job, according to the training facility. Ineffective, The emails reveal Hollis's contempt for the creatures under his care. Morgan wasted no. Addressing Judge Campbell and providing the emails as proof, Your Honor, she stated that these emails demonstrate that in addition to ignoring the law, the defendant showed a habit of cruelty and carelessness toward the animals under. The role of his employed Justice in this situation is poetic rather than CO-related. Justice, the jury's face changed again, their initial skepticism giving place to a fresh belief in Hollis's. Justice's conduct were extremely unethical in addition to being illegal, now held even more significance. And as the day came to a close, Morgan considered the rising hostilities and the complex network of revelations that had developed the defense's efforts to. Justice's part had gone horribly wrong, exposing even more of Hollis's personality and establishing As if sensing the change, the jury justice viewed the dog as a hero. Morgan couldn't assist him as he laid his head on Henry's knee, his eyes serene and trusting. Though she knew they were one step closer to justice and the truth in the courts, even though the case was far from over, had turned into a set for an unanticipated play, with new revelations appearing daily, and the case now went beyond the crime itself. It was about loyalty, redemption, and the unexpected heroes that could appear in the most improbable locations. Morgan showed up at the courthouse the next morning. The emails that AA had discovered had unsettled the defense's confidence, and the jury's cautious optimism seemed to be favoring the prosecution's story. But Morgan was aware that she couldn't rely just on She needed to bolster their case with unquestionable evidence in order to overcome the emotional pull of Justice's story. Morgan met with Justice and Henry Dawson in a peaceful area of the courthouse prior to the trial starting up again. Justice wagged his tail and scratching behind his ears. Henry remarked, "He's something special." His voice was so emotional that I've never. Morgan nodded. "I've seen a dog like him. He's the core of this case, Henry, but we need. Furthermore, we must link every die and piece of evidence Henry looked at in order to guarantee Hollis is held responsible." Morgan grinned slightly, thinking, what if Justice can aid us again? He's lead us this far. We'll see. For now, let's concentrate on what we already know. In the courtroom, Morgan summoned investigator Elena Ruiz to testify. Ruiz had been crucial in obtaining tangible proof from Hollis's home, such as the pilfered objects connected to the crime. Her testimony was intended to bring everything together and provide a precise time frame that eliminated any possibility of misunderstanding. Detective Ruiz. Morgan moved forward and asked, "Can you describe the scene when you searched the defendant's property?" Her tone was measured and professional, and we discovered a number of objects that fit the victim's family statements. The valuables, including jewels and antique watches, were concealed in a lockable storage container behind the main residence. Ruiz looked at Justice as Morgan pointed to the evidence table and asked, "How did you get access to the storage unit?" Was peacefully resting at Henry's feet, and Mr. Dawson gave us the key. We couldn't have searched the unit without it. So Morgan turned to the jury after receiving it from Justice. Ruiz nodded, which is accurate, as Justice's actions directly resulted in the finding of material that is crucial to this case. In order to minimize his cross-examination of Carter Rose, Morgan moved aside. Ruiz's testimony was significant because it implied that the evidence might have been fabricated or acquired under dubious circumstances, but Ruiz's composed and thorough responses provided little opportunity for. Undoubtedly irritated, Carter returned his focus to Justice Detective Ruiz. "Would you think that using a dog to prove something is out of the ordinary?" Ruiz might not have missed a beat, but unconventional does not imply untrustworthy. Justice's behavior was in line with his shown training and intuition. Carter persisted in believing that he was an essential component of this inquiry, but the jury's demeanor indicated they weren't. The connection between Justice and the case was too deep to buy his claims. Morgan and AA went over their plan for the afternoon session during the lunch interval, which they had discovered more details regarding Hollis's operations, such as invoices for payments made to the K-9 training facility. That Ava claimed that this might be the smoking gun, indicating a wider involvement in the illicit trading of trained animals. Morgan carefully examined the paperwork as they were slid across the table to see if we could demonstrate that Hollis was utilizing Utilizing canines for illegal activities and then throwing them away not only supports our argument, but also demonstrates a trend of behavior. Morgan gave the court the specific materials when it resumed. Transactions between Hollis and a number of dubious entities, such as the acquisition of. The jurors listened carefully as Morgan described how these transactions worked with trained canines. Linked to Hollis's criminal enterprise and Justice's background, Hollis didn't merely commit stealing. Morgan came to the conclusion that he took advantage of and threw away living things for his own benefit, demonstrating a total lack of. The jury's response to the disregard for both human and animal life was evident. The consequences of Hollis's conduct were becoming more obvious, and the trial's emotional undertone intensified. Morgan chose to call Henry Dussin back to the stand as the day came to an end because she wanted to remind the jurors of the case's human component, the manner that justice united individuals and exposed Mr. Dawson Morgan's truth. Henry grinned and asked, "Can you explain how justice has affected your life since he showed up at your door?" "I was lonely, and switching to Justice the dog rescued me just as much as it saved him. When he arrived with that key and changed everything, the farm was having trouble. He's more than just a dog. He's a." "Do you think that Justice's actions in this instance were deliberate and that he understood what was happening?" Miracle Morgan nodded. Henry's voice was firm as he was speaking, and he has a larger heart than others. He knew what was right, and he did it when Henry resigned, unlike other people I've met. Justice waved his tail as though he could sense the increasing silence in the courtroom. Support systems surrounding him. Morgan experienced a wave of hope due to the relationships between Henry Justice, Hollis, and other characters had been exposed, providing an unavoidable narrative, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. Every bit of evidence, every testimony, and every second that Justice had as the trial approached its most crucial point played a part in getting to this position when the defense and prosecution were engaged in a conflict over who could influence the. For Morgan's jury, this was the time she was getting ready to make a strong push. The day started with Carter trying to reclaim control of the NAR so that there would be no question about Hollis's guilt. Storyline: his tactic was to emphasize on the hard facts in order to counter the prosecution's emotional appeal, or rather, he called a private investigator who had been paid by the defense to examine Justice's role to testify, casting doubt on them. Grayson Hill, a stern-looking man, was the investigator in this case. Carter calmly took his seat and immediately began asking questions. "Mr. Hill, what is your professional opinion?" Hill nodded, but it's possible that Justice's actions were a coincidence rather than intentional. Frequently follow their instincts, and what can seem like intentional behavior could really be accident. Carter grinned as if the prosecution's case had been destroyed by this one remark. "Thus you're implying that it's doubtful that this dog intentionally retrieved a key to the crime." Hill shrugged. "It's unlikely, but without more proof, we cannot tell with certainty that the dog knew what it was doing when it examined Morgan Rose." Her face was composed, but she approached Hill with deliberate steps and a steady tone, her eyes keen. "Mr. Hill, are you a licensed animal behaviorist?" Hill blinked briefly, confused. "Since I don't agree with Morgan's firm voice, your assessment of Justice's actions is." Hill paused. "I guess you could say, based only on conjecture." Morgan nodded and said, "Thank you, Mr. Hill." She didn't ask any more questions because her point was obvious. The jurors noted that the defense's attempt to undermine Justice was based on shaky ground, and they shifted their attention back. The prosecution's next step in response to the case's indisputable facts was to provide the chronology of events that preceded Justice's identification of the crucial AA who had painstakingly assembled surveillance film, cello data, and, in order to testify, witness testimonies used a succession of graphics that, seen on the courtroom screens, AA guided the jury through the events in this video, which depicts Justice. As she got closer to the shed where the key was buried, she pointed to a blurry video footage, which you can watch above. Morgan moved forward to address the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," as he returned to Mr. Dawson while holding the key in his mouth. Justice's actions were purposeful and directed, bringing us straight to the proof that this wasn't a random act. Revealed the defendant's wrongdoings. Carter protested, saying the video was. Judge Campbell granted the objection because it was circumstantial and did not establish intent. But allowed Morgan to go with the defenses since their attempts to discredit them were becoming less strong. The tension in the courtroom approached a boiling point as the day went on, with justice and the evidence losing ground. Hollis Mount, who had maintained his composure during the trial, started to exhibit signs of agitation on a regular basis. Whispered to him in an effort to calm him down, but the turning point was showing the cracks in his composure. Occurred when Morgan introduced her final witness, a former Hollis employee who had disclosed important. Clara Evans, a young woman, took the stand with quivering hands. Mildly, Ms. Evans Morgan started speaking in a nice tone as she vowed to be honest. Clara hesitated, looking anxiously at Mr. Hollis, but firmly. Could you tell the court about your experience working with him? Prior to talking, I worked for Hollis for 3 years, and at first it seemed like a regular employment. But as time went on, I became aware that something wasn't quite right. Morgan nodded encouragingly, but Clara inhaled deeply, realizing that he was engaged in illicit acts. He utilized justice, one of the dogs he used for these operations, to smuggle animals and valuable objects when justice failed a mission. He left him, and the courtroom was filled with whispers. Judge Campbell sounded his gavel, requesting order, and Morgan grabbed the. Ms. Evans, are you stating that the minute her voice rises with conviction? Yes, Clara stated. The defendant not only stole, but also used animals as a kind of retribution for his illegal actions. Justice had been trained to get things for him before, but when he didn't live up to his standards, therefore he was left on his own. Morgan. Fierce ladies and gentlemen, this isn't simply a case concerning theft. It's about a man who turned to the jury in her expression. Justice didn't simply discover the key, he was looking for redemption, for after taking advantage of and discarding living things for his own sake. The abuse he received, and, in doing so, revealed the truth about David Hollis. His attorney protested, but the jury's facial expressions showed that Morgan's remarks had touched a nerve due to the case's emotional weight. Was indisputable, and as the puzzle pieces began to fit together, Morgan turned to the jury, her face. Angry ladies and gentlemen, this is a man's case, not merely a theft case, who took advantage of and threw away living things for his own benefit. Justice didn't just discover the key he was looking for, atonement for the abuse he received, and, in doing so, revealed the truth about David Hollis's attorney. Argued, but the harm had already been done. The jury's facial expressions showed that Morgan's remarks had moved the. Unquestionably, the case carried a heavy emotional burden, and the tension was finally being resolved. Was evident as the trial progressed to its concluding phase in the courtroom. The jurors was on the edge of their seats, anticipating how the pieces would fit together after each side had placed their cards on the table. Would be won over by Morgan, this moment wasn't merely about providing proof. It was about telling a story that was so gripping that the jury was unable to ignore it, and that called for justice, not just for Henry and his farm, but for the sake of justice. The dog himself took the stand the following day. It was a. Carter believed Hollis could influence the jury by exposing the defense's calculated risk, but they were at a loss for solutions. Himself as a misinterpreted businessman who had been falsely charged. But Hollis took a seat, and Morgan used this as an opportunity to break down his story piece by piece. Carter started off by asking gentle questions, portraying Hollis as a self-assured but cautious. Can you tell us about the industrious man who was unfairly singled out? Ms. Hollis? Hollis nodded, his voice measured. I've run a business, and I've contributed to the community. Prosperous logistics company that has benefited numerous people, funded local charities, and created jobs for more than 10 years. Businesses thrive. Carter turned to the jury with a smirk, perhaps saying, look, he's just simply a normal man. But when it came time for her to cross-examine Morgan's tone, he was already getting ready to attack. Was composed yet astute. Mr. Hollis, you have characterized yourself as a leader in the community. However, let's discuss your other activities. Could you clarify why several witnesses have stated that you were? Hollis's involvement in illicit trade caused him to lose confidence, which are unfounded charges. Morgan arched an eyebrow, and Clara Evans stated under oath regarding your involvement. Are you implying that Hollis lied? I'm stating that she's. Morgan pushed forward, her voice piercing the room, misinformed about the counterfeit paperwork, the pilfered items, and all the trained dogs you left behind when they were no longer useful to you. And the courtroom was quiet with everyone watching Hollis. He shuffled uneasily, but Morgan persisted and said, "Let's talk. Regarding justice, witnesses have attested to the fact that he received training under your direction. Can you dispute that, Hollis's?" Morgan countered. "I didn't personally train him, but you knew about it. And you left him because he didn't live up to your expectations. Isn't that right?" Haru's attempted to deflect that. Morgan's voice rose a little in this case, but her enthusiasm was completely applicable. Justice's acts resulted in the key to the stolen item being found, and eventually your illegal activity. In this instance, Mr. Hollis is more than just a dog. He is both a victim and a hero. Morgan turned to the jury for her closing remarks after Hollis resigned, clearly upset. She started by reciting from a stray puppy to a hero in the courtroom. Justice's story painted a striking image of devotion, tenacity, and the pursuit of justice was displayed. Away as if he didn't exist, she remarked in a steady yet empathetic voice. Yet he persisted and managed to find his way. When a moment came, he revealed the truth to Henry Dawson and accomplished what no one else could. Morgan then changed. She focuses on Hollis, but we also have a man who broke by taking advantage of animals, the law, and attempted to hide his activities because he believed he could get away with it. But Carter's closing remarks were muted because Justice had other ideas. He attempted to question the prosecution's story, which claimed that Justice's actions were justified and the evidence was circumstantial, coincidental, but his remarks lacked conviction, and the jury appeared to lose focus as they excused to deliberate, leaving Justice and Morgan Henry in the empty courtroom. Henry caressed Justice's fur while he waited in a tense quiet, his eyes full of, "Do you believe they'll see the truth?" He questioned Morgan, and he placed with a comforting pat on his shoulder. They have all they need to decide correctly. Hours later, the jury returned. The courtroom was once again packed with people waiting for the four. People were standing with a little piece of paper that would determine Hollis's destiny. In the case of David Hollis, we discover there was a general sigh of relief when the defendant was found guilty on all counts. Henry gave Justice a firm hug in the room while Morgan's eyes were watering. She closed her eyes for a moment to allow the gravity of the situation to sink in. They had done it outside the courthouse. As reporters gathered in anticipation of a remark, Morgan spoke to the gathering, forceful and unwavering. This case involved more than just larceny. It involved. Justice reminded us of devotion, bravery, and the connection between people and animals. Henry talked on the need of protecting and cherishing every life, and I hope this serves as a reminder. This saved my life in more ways than one. And the words are straightforward but sincere. As the audience applauded and the cameras flashed, Justice wagged his tail, reminding me of everything he has done for me in this community. Seemingly unaffected by the attention, he had fulfilled his destiny, and now he was eager to go back to his farm, where he was cherished and adored. The atmosphere in the courtroom was alive with the enthusiasm of the decision, and the admission of Hollis's guilt were greeted with subdued applause and a wave of relief. For Henry, Morgan, and Justice, the story's climax had not yet come. It was about more than just legal victory. It was about justice, redemption, and closure. Judge Campbell brought Justice and Morgan Henry to the bench once the court was emptied. The judge took off his glasses and "I've ruled over Justice Street," who sat submissively by Henry's side with his tail wagging faintly. Judge Campbell's voice was softer than it had been during the trial in hundreds of cases, but I've never seen. Justice is more than simply a dog. He is a representation of bravery and loyalty. I think the town is fortunate to have both of you, Henry, and you're fortunate to have him. Henry's voice shook as he, "In response to your honor, I believe I'm fortunate that Justice twice saved my life." The judge nodded seriously, saying, "I'll never be able to repay him for what he's done. Sometimes Henry is the greatest way to reward devotion with affection, and according by what I've observed, Justice is already getting a lot of that from Morgan standing next to him." In addition to the case, Henry couldn't help but feel proud of the relationship he shared with Justice. Honor interrupted Justice, who not only saved Henry, but also revealed the truth too. Judge Campbell grinned somewhat that he did, and it's a light that might not have happened without him. Lesson for everyone to believe in the unexpected and see the extraordinary in things we frequently take for granted. The press anxiously anticipated seeing Justice outside the courthouse, but now a local hero's camera shone as Morgan. As Justice and Henry emerged onto the courthouse steps, the audience applauded, with some holding placards that read Justice for. A reporter for Justice and Hero Dog of the Year yelled at Henry, "What's next for?" Henry grinned and ruffled Justice's neck fur before returning to the, "He has earned a peaceful life on the farm where he belongs, but I believe he will always remain. Do you believe this case will establish a precedent, Morgan?" Another reporter turned to Morgan for the next adventure, nodded resolutely, understanding that this case involves more than just the misdeeds of one guy or one dog. Acts. It serves as a reminder of the significance of justice and the amazing connections between people and animals. For everyone, regardless of species, while the media frenzy persisted, a small group of Henry was given a plaque from the neighborhood animal shelter that stated, "In honor of justice for loyalty, courage." Henry's voice broke as he held the plaque in his hands with unshakable love. He told the gathering, "This is for justice, but it's also for all the animals out there that have been left behind or mistreated." Justice serves as a reminder that every soul and every life matters. Deserved a chance, and the audience cheered as Justice appeared to. In reaction to the cheer, the sound made everyone in the room laugh and cry, solidifying his reputation as more than just a hero. But Henry Morgan, a well-liked local resident that night, and Justice returned to the farm, where Henry stood by the fence and watched as the sun sank, bathing the fields in a warm golden light. Justice reclined at his feet with his head resting on his paws as his animals grazed. Morgan smiled contentedly as she joined him, as if the storm had. Henry nodded, keeping his eyes focused on the horizon as she remarked, "Finally passed. I never imagined that the day would come when everything seemed normal again. I owe Justice for bringing me back to life, Morgan." I believe that Justice is aware of everything that Morgan reached down to scratch behind his ears, and he feels the same way. As the stars started to appear in the night sky, Henry knelt next to Justice and spoke to him as if, "You've done more than I could have ever asked, buddy, and you've given me hope once more, I swear." He was an old friend. Justice responded with a gentle tail wagging, saying, "You'll always have a home here." It was a simple gesture. However, it spoke eloquently about a love-sealed tie formed through hardship. Justice became a local legend in the ensuing weeks, and Henry was invited by legend schools to talk about his experience and impart lessons about justice, compassion, and resiliency. Sat proudly by his side, always accompanying him, while youngsters listened in awe. After being motivated by the case, Morgan too launched a community project, utilizing Justice's tale as a rallying cry to help abused animals. The Justice's Legacy initiative sought to offer care, shelter, and second opportunities to help needy animals. But for Henry and Justice, life gradually came back to. Justice cheerfully followed Henry everywhere he went at night, and the days were spent caring for the farm in a tranquil rhythm, were silent, until one evening Henry could hear crickets and the wind rustling through the trees. Justice curled up at his feet as he sat on the porch sipping tea as the sky was tinted in pink and orange. A reminder that there is always light at the end of the darkest storms. Just as Henry grinned down at him, saying, "You're more than just a dog, Justice. You're my family," and it was evident that Justice shared the tranquility of the world in the stillness of the evening when everyone was at peace. Farm stood in sharp contrast to the flurry of activity that had taken place in the town and the courthouse for Henry and the regular rhythm of Justice life had returned. Yet the echoes of their tale persisted in reverberating much beyond the quiet field. Justice had turned into a reminder of bravery, devotion, and determination may originate in the most unlikely locations throughout the nation. His tale, sharing the incredible journey of a dog who not only saved his owner, can be covered by news sources going forward, but discovered a network of dishonesty and criminal activity. Henry had to get used to his newfound fame. Because of the attention their story had received, the farm that had previously struggled to make ends meet was now flourishing. Henry embraced guests from all over the world who wanted to meet Justice the hero dog and told them his story. With everyone who was willing to listen, but for him, Justice was always the same regardless of fame. The world was just protected. Henry stayed faithful while taking care of the animals and enjoying the love of everyone who visited him. Friend who, one afternoon, endured danger and storms to protect his owner. Morgan's bright smile appeared instantly when a car arrived into the driveway, while Henry was fixing the barn door. She had a modest stack of papers in her arms. Henry, lighting up the scene. Henry cleaned his hands and said, "I have something for you," as he approached him. When he met her halfway through wearing his overalls, his interest grew. "What is this?" he questioned. Morgan smiled as he accepted the documents, confirming that Justice is being recognized as the official. Every year on Justice Day, Henry chuckled and shook his head, honoring the town's first honorary guardian. Justice resting in the shade, that dog's going to receive more honors than I will in my lifetime. Nearby, Morgan knelt next to him, wagging his tail idly while his ears perked up at the sound of his name. "He deserves it, Henry, and you both earn it for rubbing behind his ears. Went above and beyond simply rescuing a farm. As the first justice, you taught everyone what it is to stand up for what's right." A few weeks later, families met for a day in the town square, where kids donned t-shirts with Justice's face printed on them. And when it was Henry's turn, the mayor spoke passionately about the connection between people and animals. Henry turned to speak, addressing the audience with quiet earnestness. "This dog saved my. Justice is not only a hero to me, but he's a hero in many ways. Family. And I hope that his tale encourages everyone to see the worth of every life." The applause that followed, no matter how minor or disregarded, was thunderous, and, as Justice yelled, the audience burst into. As time went on, he continued to be the show's main attraction, receiving applause and laughs. Morgan's community project, Justice's Legacy, grew in strength. Volunteers and donations flooded in to assist needy animals. The campaign spokesperson was Justice himself, whose narrative serves as a beacon of hope for both people and animals. Through their joint efforts, Morgan and Henry became closer, but they never pursued the limelight for their commitment to. They became humble local heroes of kindness and tenacity as a result of Justice's legacy. Morgan joined Henry one evening as they sat on the patio to watch the sunset. Justice rested at their feet, with his head resting on Henry's cup of tea. "Do you ever consider how your life may have turned out differently if Justice hadn't entered it?" Henry nodded slowly and thoughtfully every time Morgan inquired. "I don't know. Where would I be without him? He gave me a reason to continue when I felt like I had lost everything." Morgan grinned and looked at me. Moving to the horizon, he serves as a reminder that even if he is a dog, as the stars start to appear in the sky, there is always hope even in the most dire circumstances. "You hear that, son? You're more than a dog." Henry reached down to pat Justice's side. Justice wagged his tail as though he knew every word over the years. "And you're a miracle." Past. And even though the world kept changing, Henry and Justice's friendship remained unbreakable on the farm. The Justice's legacy spread to nearby communities, and their tale was incorporated into the history of the area 4. Henry's life was now about appreciation, love, and the pursuit of happiness rather than survival. Modest pleasures of each day, spent with his faithful friend when the last of the sun's rays fell beyond the horizon one. On a calm evening, Henry and Justice sat on the porch, the farmless, looking down at his beloved. The quiet air was filled with cricket murmur and the odd rustle of leaves. Henry, a friend, lowered his head and said, "Thank you, Justice, for everything." A lifetime's worth of love and understanding was shared in that silent moment when his eyes met Henry's. The tale of Henry and Justice serves as a reminder to everyone of the extraordinary connection between people and animals, as well as the transformative. If this story resonated with you, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Read more touching stories, and never forget to show compassion, no matter how. Little things can have a big impact. See you in the next story.